John McMullen. Joining us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline with a look at all things Eagles NFL here on the Sports Bash. You know, everybody, Carson Wentz included, saying week one, week one, week one. Today, Doug Pederson played devil's advocate, John.
Yeah, he wanted, I think, temper expectations because it has been really centered in week one, as you mentioned, week one. Carson hasn't really even departed even a little bit from that mentality. And I think Doug was just being extra cautious and saying, and he's right, it's still really, really early in the process. There's a long time before he's even going to be medically cleared. And you want to be cautious and you want to make sure that you don't overdo it in an effort to get back for week one. But while I say that, that's still the plan. That's still the ultimate goal. He just wants to make sure. Remember, we've got to go through rookie minicamp today. We've got to go through on-field OTAs, the minicamp, and training camp. And through all that time, Carson's not going to be on the field until he gets cleared, hopefully late in August. And so there's kind of something to say for getting it out of the way and saying, look, still a long way off, still relatively early, essentially 5 months out since the injury. So he's got a ways to go before he's even cleared medically.
Yeah, and I think we're all kind of, assuming that they're going to be very, very cautious with him. But if that's the assumption, I don't know. I know you think he'll be ready, but if that's the assumption, I really have a tough time thinking that he's going to be ready to play for that first week. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. And I'm typically someone who, the whole Embiid thing, I was like, look, the guy will be fine. The Simmons thing, the guy will be fine. Injuries aren't something that, like, in today's world, medically, these guys are going to be okay. They're going to get through it. But just the timing of when his ACL happened, I have a hard time thinking he's going to be ready for week one.
Well, it is. We talked about the timing, how eerie it was, really. It was a 9-month timetable. It got injured on December 10th. The opener's on September 6th, so that's a few days before 9 months. Ultimately, I've said a lot of times I believe he will be cleared. I believe he will be out there for week one. I haven't departed from that thought. I think it comes down to, and Doug, not on purpose, but even in this conversation he had this morning, he contradicted himself while talking about other injured players, whether it's Jason Peters or Jordan Hicks or Chris Maragos or Darren Sproles, and everybody coming back from various injuries. In the reality, he kind of said, and he's right, by the way, veteran players like that don't really need this off-season work. And the ultimate point of that is when they're medically cleared, they're going to play. And that's just what a star player does. If Carson was a rookie and he was still learning the system and coming from North Dakota State and he had this type of injury, I'd have a whole different thought process on it. And I don't think he would be put out there week one. But the fact he knows this offense, he doesn't have to learn things. He doesn't have to go through the off-season process. As soon as he's medically cleared, he's the best quarterback on this team. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He's going to be out there.
John McMullen with us, talking Eagles football, which we always like. They officially announced their 15-man undrafted free agent class. John, which name there stands out the most to you, and who has the most likelihood of making the team?
Well, I think the most known would be Josh Adams, the most high profile, the running back from Notre Dame, local kid, went to CB South, Warrington, Pennsylvania native. So that's the guy everybody knows. And he was a very good running back in college. I think he was sort of almost held against him. The offensive line he ran behind. If you look at Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey, both top 10 picks in this draft. So I think he's got a chance. But as I tweeted, if you're looking for one undrafted free agent that is the most likely to make this team, I think it's Jeremy Reeves, safety out of South Alabama, for a couple reasons. Eagles showed enormous interest in him in the pre-draft process. I believe he could have been a sixth or seventh round pick if they had more picks to use. Obviously, they only ended up with 5 draft picks. He was one of the first guys they called, and he's developed relationships with the area scout who sort of uncovered him for the Eagles, and he's already talked a lot with Jim Schwartz. So they have a lot of interest in his skill set. He comes from a school that played a pro-style defense. He called it a Seattle-like cover 3 defense when I talked to him today. So from that standpoint, he's kind of ahead of the curve for a normal rookie when it comes to learning NFL defenses, and the Eagles like him a lot. So you can never say an undrafted guy is likely to make the team, but if you're looking for one that's going to be this year's Corey Clement, I think he's the most logical one that fits into that category.
So that's the 15-man undrafted free agent class. How about the 21 tryout players? I mean, is this the Willy Wonka golden ticket, hope against hope? If you're coming as a tryout player, enjoy the jersey, enjoy being in a facility that has defending Super Bowl champs on it, but that's about all you can hope for?
Yeah, I mean, generally in these types of things, everybody does it now, and you usually sort of get through rookie minicamp, and 1 or 2 will get signed, and 1 or 2 of those undrafted free agents will be cut. That's generally what happens. But, yeah, it's an extreme long shot if you're here as a tryout player. I guess if you look around the league, probably the most notable who went that route and became a star would be Adam Thielen in Minnesota. But it does not happen very often, and it's probably not going to happen here.
Just because we're on undrafted free agents and guys coming in, the local kid, Joe Callahan, got signed, and I know Doug was asked about him today. Did you find Doug's answer to be a positive or negative toward Joe Callahan's chances?
None of the above. It is. I mean, he's brought in because the Eagles need an extra arm for the off-season work. We just talked about Carson Wentz. He's going to be throwing off to the side, but he's not going to be working in any team drills or anything of that nature. So Joe kind of slots in as the third guy behind Nick Foles and Nate Sudfeld. And then we'll see how he does throughout the offseason and into training camp. But it's just the reality of the situation that you need 3 quarterbacks when you're doing this kind of off-season work. Otherwise, you develop that high pitch count on your backup quarterbacks who will ultimately be, and that's not good. It's probably not that big of a deal for a young guy like Sudfeld, but for Nick, who's had elbow problems in the past, the last thing you want to do is overwork him in the off season because you haven't brought in that extra body, and I think that's where Joe fits in.
Sports Bash Live, 97.3 ESPN. John McMullen is with us. Doug was asked today about some of his veteran free agent signings, guys like Richard Rodgers, Matt Jones, Marcus Wheaton. These were guys who have some NFL success. What kind of expectations is he anticipating for those guys?
Competition. I mean, that's what they want to do, and create competition at every position, except punter, which is a weird one to me, but that's another conversation. But that's the whole mentality, is push guys and see if it makes some of the younger players get better. We talked a little bit about the running back situation yesterday, Mike, or a couple days ago with Jones being brought in, and maybe that lights a spark under Wendell Smallwood or Donnell Pumphrey, or maybe he just beats them out. Either way, that's what competition does, and you ultimately decide on the best players. And all of those guys have an opportunity, I think, to make this roster. And certainly in the case of Jones, if he can cure the fumbling problem, if Wheaton can stay healthy, Rodgers gives the Eagles something that they don't have elsewhere on the roster, and that's the ability to be an inline tight end. So I think that's always been the mentality of this team, and you'll see it continue. I think they'll bring in a veteran body at some point at defensive tackle, and that's because they don't want to hand things to young players, at least most of the time. Cameron Johnson being the exception.
Oh, John, you're leaving that low-hanging fruit for me. Tell us about the punting situation. You know my affinity for punters and kickers. I got to know what's going on.
Yeah, I wish I could explain it to you other than the Eagles really, really like Cameron Johnston, and they don't have another punter on the roster. They didn't even bring in another punter as a tryout player. It's him right now, and it's pretty clear they expect him to be the full-time punter next season. Got a chance to talk to him because he's allowed to participate in rookie minicamp because he wasn't on the roster last year. And you know, he realizes things can change very quickly in the NFL, and they can bring a punter in tomorrow if he has. They can bring one in next week if he has a bad week. So it's not a fait accompli yet. But Dave Phipp has been preaching consistency. That's the biggest thing for every young punter or kicker, for that matter, in this league. And they certainly want him to win the job. So it's all there for him, and it's his to lose.
John, one of the questions that you asked Doug Pederson was about the coaching changes, and sometimes we don't, give enough credit to the assistants or the guys who don't get a lot of mention are those secondary assistants too, not just the coordinators, the position coaches and all that. So as far as the staff changes go, it seemed like Pederson really went in depth in this question.
Yeah, he did, and because there's been a lot of change especially on the offensive side of the football, with them losing Frank Reich and John DeFilippo. A lot of dominoes fall. You got Mike Groh as the offensive coordinator. He moves from the wide receiver coaching position. So you hire Gunter Brewer. You have DeFilippo. Press Taylor gets elevated to be the quarterback's coach. And then you have Deuce Staley and Jeff Stoutland, who got sort of promotions and more responsibility. Deuce as assistant head coach, and Jeff Stoutland as pretty much in charge of the running game, which Doug said today, and that's sort of his baby. So it's going to be interesting. The Eagles lost two really, really good coaches that are highly thought of. Obviously, Frank is a head coach. Everybody knows in this league John is going to be a head coach probably sooner rather than later. And that's one of those things you got to keep an eye on and see how it develops, because while we always talk about Super Bowl attrition, nobody really thinks about the coaching staff. And the Eagles have had a lot, as I said, dominoes, moving parts with that coaching staff. And you really just have to see how it shakes out.
Darren Sproles coming back, John McMullen, and Doug Pederson, a big advocate for Darren Sproles coming back. What did he have to say now that that's official?
Doug loves Darren Sproles, and it's all NFL organizations are pretty secretive by and large, and the Eagles probably more so than most. But the one thing everybody knows that ever sets foot in the NovaCare complex is Doug loves Darren Sproles, and he was advocating for him to come back just about every day. Howie Roseman joked twice a day he would stick his head in his office and say, "When is Darren coming back? When are you going to sign Darren?" And they did it after the draft, after they weren't able to add what they wanted at the running back position. And I think Doug is happy. I think Joe Douglas and Howie Roseman would have preferred to get younger, to be honest, and bring in a guy like Ronald Jones. But if you ask Doug, he'd rather have Darren Sproles. And he's just extremely, extremely comfortable with him, and rightfully so. I mean, he's a veteran player who understands his role, understands what to do, and he rarely makes mistakes.
So sticking on running backs, John, and that theme of running backs, what does Doug expect out of Donnell Pumphrey?
I don't think anybody, Doug's not going to throw him under the bus, certainly, but I don't think anybody expects anything from Donnell Pumphrey at this point until shows up and he does it and proves he can sort of be an NFL player from a physical standpoint.
Well, would you suggest that they were disappointed in him?
Tremendously disappointed.
From a skill set or from a lack of ability to work? Or obviously you said he's really small. I mean, that's not his fault. Or could he work on that?
Well, he could work on it. I always joke that people would make the comparisons to Pumphrey and Sproles because they're both small running backs, and I always say with Darren's not small, he's short. He's incredibly thick in the lower body, and Donnell Pumphrey has got to get stronger, and he can work on that. And that was the biggest thing. I don't think it's a skill set standpoint. If you remember last year during rookie minicamp and OTAs, he was sort of a star of the offseason. And that's when you don't have pads on. And you're out there in shirts and shorts. And he looked great. And then the pads came on, and he went away. And he wasn't relevant. And that's he just wasn't big or strong enough to play in this league. So he has to get stronger. He has to prove he does that. And you're going to hear stories about Donnell doing some things in the offseason like you did last year. None of it's going to matter until August and the pads are on, and if he can show he can be an NFL player from a physical standpoint. I think that's the biggest issue with him.
John McMullen's with us. Dallas Goedert also out on the field. You get your first chance to see what kind of athlete this guy is.
Yeah, well, he looks the part. That's not the issue with Dallas Goedert, and he's got a lot of confidence. He's really a Zach Ertz clone, almost physically. He's a long, lengthy tight end, and that's how he plays. He likes to be detached. He likes to be a receiving threat, and that's why I've said, he's not going to unseat Zach. So ultimately, it's kind of interesting. Can you get the two of them on the field at the same time and create mismatches? If you do, you're going to have to figure out the blocking scheme. So that's going to be one of those things that I argued. We just talked about Pumphrey last year. The big star of the offseason was the Eagles' 21 pony formation. That's when Sproles and Pumphrey were on the field at the same time. This year, it's going to be that 12 Tiger personnel, as they call it, with two tight ends, with Ertz and Goddard on the field at the same time.
Well, as long as you don't give me the old Chip Kelly, I just put up three fingers and three tight ends go out in the field.
Well, and you say S8, and then, and they'll use some 13 personnel as well. Likely Richard Rodgers being the third tight end, and maybe Billy Brown can push in, but somebody's got to block at some point. So I imagine Rodgers will be able to win a roster spot if he's healthy. My point, though, is things can look good without the pads on, and then when you put the pads on, it's unrealistic to use that sort of that formation, that scheme, which is what happened with 21 Pony. Eagles just couldn't use it. That might be how putting Ertz and Goddard on the field, if one of them can't improve as a blocker dramatically, I'm not sure how much they could use it.
John Jordan Mailata out there is a nice man, you said. You're not sure if he can play, but he seems like a nice man. However, what kind of athlete is this guy? I mean, is he the kind of guy that they would keep around regardless of whether he could play or not?
Well, I think he's got a chance to make the practice squad. I was joking with Josh. He's got no shot to make the 53-man roster. I mean, he's just too raw. This is a long-term developmental prospect, and he is a tremendous athlete for his size, and he is big. if he gets cut by the Eagles, Vince McMahon might be calling him tomorrow. He's just almost freakishly sized, length of his arms, and that's why they drafted him. Because I joked about it on draft night when they did draft him. If you sort of created a left tackle in the lab, this would be what it looks like from a physical standpoint. But he's never played the game before. He's not even used to wearing a helmet. I mean, you think about things he's got to get used to. He joked about how heavy the helmet was, and he hasn't gotten the pads on. And he said,
"Crazy.
We're going to see how heavy that is." And it is. You were following me today on Twitter. You saw it one time. He didn't even get off the ball. He forgot, and then Jeff Stoutland came over and said, "This is the point where you move and get off the ball." So that's really, square one. That's where they're working on him. And as I said, it is a long-term developmental project.
Wow. John McMullen, by the way, if there was 50-some players and 38 media guys, who would be your pool player?
Well, I would choose one of the big. As I said, I would choose Jeremy Reeves, who I mentioned, or Josh Adams. But yeah, at one point we're going to get to that. I joked that we're going to have one reporter to one player, and then we can all just interview one player and share information. That's Philadelphia. And I think, it's interesting because the rookies, they're not cynical. They haven't dealt with any of this before. They're just so happy to be there, so happy that people want to talk to them. And it's a dream for all of them, even the tryout players. And it happens every year. And then we ruin them all.
Right.
By middle of the season, they're like, get away from me.
John McMullen, follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. Is there more camp this weekend?
Yeah, it goes through the weekend. Saturday and Sunday is rookie camp, but this is the only day that the media is allowed in. So nobody gets to see it. We don't even get to see it. So the rest of it is closed. And then the OTAs with all the veterans, on-field work, May 22nd.
JF McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. And, of course, check out his new NFL column, which you can get at getmoresports.com. He's John McMullen. Thank you, pal. Have a good weekend.
Hey, you too, guys.